A lot of the fun with RPGs comes from player expression, choosing your favorite tools and tackling the challenges with what you've chosen. The thing is, most RPGs I've played don't shackle the player with enough restrictions to make your expression feel meaningful. If every strategy works, is it even a question of developing a strategy anymore? If you can ignore these tools and still beat the game, that expression is little more than a veneer. It's superficial. We want freedom in games, we want every option to be viable, but we don't realize what we're giving up to attain that freedom. But what if we try to reintroduce those restrictions? Can we make that expression meaningful again? This video will focus on Final Fantasy XII, but you can apply most of what I say here to any game with a job system. I already made a video covering the basic elements of Final Fantasy XII, so I'm going to skip the surface level observations. This is a sort of companion piece to that video where I elaborate on some of my favorite parts of the gameplay. The original release of Final Fantasy XII didn't have a clear implementation of the job system. You were given a giant grid of licenses, and you could chart a course through it in any manner you saw fit. Want everyone to pick up White Mage? Go for it. Without any clear distinction of roles and without any hard restrictions, everyone could do everything. What reason was there to use the full suite of characters if your main three guys could do it all? There wasn't a reason. Why not have every melee fighter don heavy armor for that strength bonus, and ignore all the other armor options? There's nothing stopping you, so go for it. Why use healing items and motes if everyone can cast magic? See, with all that freedom, it was easy to capitalize on the most powerful gear and spells, and ignore a huge chunk of what the game had on offer. And this is something that I've seen in almost every RPG in existence. The director recognized the consequences of unrestricted freedom and sought to rebalance the game with a sort of remixed version, International Zodiac Job System. Despite the name, this was never released outside of Japan. Square Enix used to create enhanced editions of games based on their international ports, but they would make them Japanese exclusive. So when they did this for Final Fantasy XII, the director and his team introduced limitations by creating clear role distinctions. So on top of forcing the player to interact with more variables, this addressed another issue present in the original release. You didn't have an incentive to use reserve characters. The job system is based off one principle, and it's in the name, job. You're assigning each character a job, and that entails strengths and weaknesses that are meant to work in tandem with other jobs. In other words, no more one-man army, can't sling spells, tank hits, and strike with the best weapon all with one guy. If you want a White Mage on the team, she's not going to be casting high-level black magic. She's primarily going to fill that clerical role. Do you want a party member permanently devoted to healing duty everywhere you go? Probably not, so you can swap her in and out as needed. That's where the reserve members come into play. This job system forces restrictions to encourage more strategic play. In the original game, any obstacle can be circumvented with grinding because every license is up for grabs. In International, what if the team you're using doesn't have any magic options? It's not game over, you just need to find a workaround. That part right there, finding the workaround, learning what does and doesn't work, that is what I love about video games. It's satisfying to improve when you're saddled with restrictions, because you don't know if you're gonna succeed. When you do succeed, it's because you earned that success, you overcame that hurdle. Square eventually released the international version of Final Fantasy XII to the rest of the world and rebranded it as the Zodiac Age. This version came with a lot of small changes, but the most important change was this. It allowed each character to pick up a second job. In International, a Black Mage was a Black Mage forever. He couldn't reclass, he couldn't pick up White Mage. You chose a role and stuck with that role, and the game was balanced around each character's kit, revolving around that single job. In the Zodiac Age, hybridizing jobs allows you to circumvent the inherent weaknesses of a job, going against the original intent of International's creation, and the game wasn't rebalanced to account for this. Enemy stats and formations weren't adjusted to compensate for your increased flexibility. They're still tuned around each character having one job. So now we're back to the original game's balancing, where you can pick up magic vocations as a secondary job and ignore reserve members. You can use guns on a character that isn't saddled with the lackluster license grid that Machinist carries. You can grab Monk as a second job to boost the health of jobs that don't have many HP licenses. Being able to create hybrid jobs is cool. I love this component of the job system, but it's at the cost of balance. Jobs are usually tuned to be usable by their lonesome. Once you start bundling their kit with elements from other jobs, you wind up creating game-breaking interactions, and this is present in most games I've played that have job systems. I want to show you what I mean using Bravely Default as an example. Bravely Default not only lets you subclass, it lets you equip passives from any job. This is Dark Knight, a job that revolves around damaging yourself to deal stronger attacks. This presents a risk-reward situation during combat. Do I want to put my health in the danger zone for a huge damage swing? The risk is that I'm putting myself close to death, and the reward is that I'm potentially killing an enemy before it gets off a powerful attack. That's what makes Dark Knight distinct from other jobs. Being able to equip a subclass means you can look for a way to compensate for that self-inflicted damage, and that muddies the identity of the job. You can still play as a pure Dark Knight, of course, you don't have to subclass. But hybridizing jobs in RPGs lets you offset a job's weakness, and that takes away from an important part of the experience, at least for me, which is learning to work with that weakness. Patching the holes in a job strips away from its unique identity. Dark Knight is no longer about flirting with death, it's about throwing out huge damage numbers with no drawback. So what can we subclass to help us minimize that self-inflicted damage? Spellfencer. Sword Magic Drain lets us buff our character so that we heal with each attack. This lets us use Dark Knight's ultimate attack, Rage, without setting our HP to 1. That alone would be powerful, but it wouldn't be a game-breaking interaction. Let's break the game. Merchant has an ability called Low Leverage. This cuts damage and healing in half, which sounds bad, but it also cuts BP cost in half. Well, the Dark Knight's ultimate attack costs 2 BP to cast, so let's cut that to 1. Now we can cast it twice as frequently at the cost of half our damage. That would equalize the overall damage output, but since there's a damage cap, if you can deal enough damage to break that cap and then cut that in half, you can salvage that overflow to deal a ton more damage. I know that sounds confusing, but basically it lets you deal more damage. So now we've got a huge burst of damage at the start of battle, and the only downside is if we blow our load and the boss isn't dead, our team is sitting on negative BP, they turn into punching bags for a few turns. Let's patch that with Hasten World from Time Mage, which gives us an extra BP at the start of every turn, and the cherry on top, Stillness from Spirit Master, which makes everyone immune to damage for 2 turns. Not only are we dealing insane bursts, we're immune while we recover. Works against literally every single fight in the entire game across any difficulty. If you fight an undead enemy, use Sword Magic Fire instead of Drain since draining an undead unit hurts you. This is the job system at its most extreme, but it takes a lot of effort to reach that point. This is an endgame setup and it requires grinding up several jobs to their highest level for every character. It's also not something you can easily throw together or find by accident. You've got to be well versed in job interactions or look up a guide, but even then, someone put in the work. Theorizing those interactions, putting together a team, experimenting in battle, then refining your setup is what makes the job system a beautiful thing. In the early to mid game, when you don't have a ton of powerful jobs and haven't leveled them up to reach their ultimate abilities, that's when games with job systems are at their most challenging, and for me, the most entertaining. Becoming the walking nuclear bomb that is endgame is your reward for overcoming those challenges, but it also means these games end on a low note. In Bravely Default, once you get this Dark Knight configuration rolling in Chapter 4 or 5, the next 15 to 20 hours it takes to clear the remaining content is a joke. You'll never take damage. Fighting the most powerful entity across time and space shouldn't be easier than the rats I fought at level 1. Maybe you think otherwise, and I wouldn't say you're wrong, because I'm conflicted here. On one hand, I don't want an RPG to force me to play a certain way, or balance enemies around the most powerful setup, because isn't that choice aspect the appeal of an RPG? That would take away from the joy of playing with whichever job you like. One job may not be as powerful as the rest, but it sure is more fun to play, and I don't want to feel punished for playing with it. On the other hand, if I've got a powerful build rolling, I want to meet a challenge that makes the most of it. If it tears through everything and I'm using the same strategy to kill every boss, that's not really that much fun. The final boss and optional super bosses shouldn't feel equally as dangerous as a level 2 moth or mosquito. Here's where I'd usually point a finger at the developer for expecting players to balance the game in their stead, but I'm gonna pull the hypocrite card here because I've played games with job systems for long enough to understand my preferred playstyle anyway. Since you're not forced to subclass, you can still play Bravely Default with a nice level of challenge, and the same can be said for Final Fantasy XII. You can play the Zodiac Age similar to how you would International, sticking with one job and locking yourself out of the other ones, introducing that aspect of permanency. That's what I'm looking for. An option doesn't feel meaningful if it doesn't come with a cost, and I've seen more than a few modern games let you respec on command. I almost never defend a game for being imbalanced, and I've said in the past that a player shouldn't have to handicap himself to get the most out of a game, and people have told me, if you don't like it, don't use it, and I've always disagreed with that statement. But if there are no rules when it comes to having fun, why should I disagree? When I asked myself that, I realized I shouldn't. Not only that, I've been handicapping myself with games to get more enjoyment from them for longer than I realized. So here's my contradictory, full-blown hypocrite video where I go against everything I've said because at the end of the day, I'm just a casual enjoyer of games. Here's how I have fun with Final Fantasy XII and any game with a job system. 13 or 14 years ago, a little while ago, something called the 4-Job Fiesta was created. This was a specialized rule set you'd apply to a playthrough of Final Fantasy V, and it was held as a yearly charity event. You'd sign up and be assigned 4 jobs with one goal: beat the game with access to only those 4 jobs. There are different modifiers, different rules you can apply, but the core idea was simple: 1 job per character. This was the first time I finished Final Fantasy V, and at the end, I walked away with 2 lessons learned. One was that I didn't really like Final Fantasy V, let's not get into that here, but the other was that I could apply this rule set to any game with a job system. With the Zodiac Age, I play it as a sort of 6-job fiesta, 1 job per character, and repeats are allowed. I don't change jobs after they're assigned, and I don't take advantage of hybrid jobs. Whichever job a character is assigned will remain that job until the credits roll. I used to assign each job to a number and then roll dice for each character. That's a little too D&D for my taste. Then I watched some old game shows and I thought, why not make a wheel? We can also go the more extreme route and spin for 1 job that everyone shares, so that's what I did here. I landed on Monk. Let's use an all-Monk team to talk about a few examples. Here's the beauty of using 1 job for everyone, because it's not as one-dimensional as you'd think. If everyone's a Monk, that doesn't mean, alright, everyone's going to be a frontline fighter, because remember, Final Fantasy XII lets you program your party members thanks to gambits. We can change action priorities for each character and have one of them prioritize healing. For that designated healer, I can pick up Potion and Phoenix Lores from the license grid, and these increase the healing potency of potions and Phoenix Downs. These licenses also stack with the accessory Pheasant Netsuke, so even though I don't have a white mage on the team, I can turn one of my monks into a chemist. You'd have close to 0 incentive for picking up these licenses or using this accessory if you play with a red or white mage, or if you play without restrictions. There's so many elements that appear superfluous, but their usefulness shines on a 2nd or 3rd playthrough when you try something different. This isn't something you're doing for style points. We're not using junk moves to get an S rank. We're putting ourselves in situations where we use situational tools. That's when you'll realize that the devs had the foresight to not punish the player for skipping certain jobs. Spells and accessories you thought were useless are far from it. Here's an example: Knots of Rust. On a blind playthrough, a player will find one of these early on, chuck it at an enemy, see that it does little damage, and ignore it till the end of time. A somewhat curious player will look up what these do, and discover that they buff another item called Dark Matter. The more Knots of Rust you use, the stronger Dark Matter becomes. An even more curious player will learn that these Knots of Rust deal a range of damage that's dependent on your max HP. So if you use a high HP job like Monk, and equip him with light armor for the HP boost, and find a way to cast Bubble on him to double his HP, that will buff the power of these knots. So forget Dark Matter, chuck the knots and clean house. There's so much to this game that you'll never interact with if you have it hard set in your head, I need the MMO configuration. Gotta have a damage dealer, a tank, and a healer. You can use a trio of damage dealers and have it work better than fine. Just need to get creative. Now I don't have a photographic memory, so sometimes I do some light routing for the early game using the wiki as an aid. By routing I mean, I'll decide on what my objectives should be and how I'll go about completing them. My first objective is to get a decent weapon. That makes sense, that's a reasonable objective, right? Monks have two combat options, barehanded with the Brawler license and poles. Unlike monks in Final Fantasy Tactics where barehanded monks were insanely strong, doubly so if you dual-wielded fists, barehanded in Final Fantasy XII isn't great. Poles pretty much always outpaces it, and going beyond straight damage, poles have the added utility of being able to hit flying creatures. That's an incredible benefit since we can't use bows or guns, and monks don't learn telekinesis. They don't need it anyway. Here's footage from another playthrough. I only have one character in the team capable of hitting flying enemies, so it takes longer to kill them. A fight that's easy for one job can be challenging for another. That's replay value. That's incentive to walk through the game in a different pair of shoes. I think younger players view replay value in terms of unlockables like difficulty modes, achievements, or different endings. That's why we see these components in so many modern games. I don't view replay value in defined concrete ways like unlocking features. If I want replay value, I try a different playstyle. Poles also factor an enemy's magic defense into their damage equation, which isn't relevant here since everyone's using the same weapon type, but it's something to consider if you're rolling with different jobs and want to make a well-rounded team. What's great about Final Fantasy XII's weapon system is there's functionality beyond equipping whatever has the biggest number. Guns look weaker than other weapon types, plus they have a slower charge time, but they ignore defense. Measures also ignore defense, and they apply beneficial status effects on hit, so you can attack your team for buffs without using MP. On a normal run, these weapons are fairly unremarkable, but they sing on New Game Minus, where your level is locked at 1. I've got an underlevel team here, and look at how the Machinist is dealing more damage than anyone else. The other thing to consider is that if I'm rolling without a mage, I'm gonna rely on items to keep healthy, and those can get expensive in the early game when you're trying to keep up with gear. We could grind and sell drops for money, but instead of working harder, let's work smarter. Zodiac Age has something called Trial Mode, which ties into your save from the main game. Any loot you acquire in Trial Mode is transferred to your campaign save. In the first trial stage, we can grab a guaranteed diamond armlet from a chest, finish the stage, boot up our save, and now we've got it outside of Trial Mode. The diamond armlet is an accessory that modifies the loot table for chests, usually replacing items with knots of rust and meteorites. We don't want those, but if we sell the armlet, we get a cool 6,000 gil. You can repeat this method to get as much gil as you need. We don't need much, and I don't want to sit on 1,000,000 gil, but we can make use of this to buy a ton of Phoenix Downs and do something called Dustia farming. There's a rare spawn called Dustia that only appears if you enter a specific zone with less than 10% of your maximum HP. It's an undead enemy, meaning it's susceptible to healing spells and items. If you throw a Phoenix down at Dustia, it's an instant kill. You could use this method to overlevel right at the start. We're not here for that. I farmed Dustia to show a couple of different tricks. If you zone out right after killing it, just before it shows the experience and LP you received, Dustia will respawn immediately when you re-enter. Ordinarily, you need to zone out to a different area like Ravenaster to get it to reappear, which will break your chain. But the respawn trick avoids that, so we can chain Dustia. Chaining increases the drop rate and drop quantity, which can be super useful on a challenge run. With Dustia in particular, its rare drop is the Flame Staff, useless on monks, but on a black mage, it boosts fire damage by 50%, so nabbing one this soon is a big deal. I actually learned something new playing this game again. I was trying to drop my HP low enough to get Dustia to spawn. You can do this by hitting yourself or letting enemies hit you, but it's a little tricky to hit that critical range without dying. If you equip the diamond armlet and open chests, there's a chance you'll get an item called Meteorite. There's a type of meteorite that casts sap, so if you use it on yourself, sap your HP to 1 and you're good to go. I was getting unlucky with a chest and didn't feel like spending too much time on this. Then I noticed a wandering NPC in this area. If you get close to him while at low HP, he casts Protect on you. With Protect up, I was able to get an enemy to drop my HP low enough without killing me. A super cool interaction. I don't remember seeing this on past playthroughs, and it's something that wouldn't feel useful in most circumstances, but it turned into a memorable moment here. With all this early game money from selling Dustia drops and diamond armlets, we can take advantage of a somewhat hidden system involving the merchants. Talking to shop owners and examining the hunt board dozens of times will eventually unlock grimoires for purchase. These open up a new type of drop from enemies called monograph drops. For some enemies, their monograph drops are used in powerful bazaar recipes, stuff you'd probably want to follow a guide for. These grimoires are very expensive, but if you've got the gil to burn and the desire to min-max, the monograph system is yet another layer of complexity you can tack on. We can do all of this right at the start of the game, and the beauty of playing a challenge run is we have an incentive to interact with all this depth. If you're playing a normal run, intending to give everyone 2 jobs, the game will be so easy that you don't even need to consider things like grinding or amassing a ton of gil, looking for rare drops, or making high-end gear. If you're tackling an even stiffer challenge like a solo character run, things like Dustia farming and making the most expensive bazaar equipment starts to look a lot more appealing. These restrictions, they show you how much depth is hidden here. You're tackling the game from another side, so you see a different face. This is why discussing RPGs is so challenging. It's because you can come at them from different angles. In a regular action game, you've got a moveset, you've got a path to follow, fight the curated enemies on that path. It's easy to judge if the challenge is tuned well. RPGs can have a dozen different systems working in tandem. You can ignore half of them, pick and choose what you like, and each player will walk away with a different experience. How do you balance something like that? And how can you judge the quality of that balance? I don't know. So instead, I think it's better to judge RPGs based on how well you can tune them to suit your preference. There'll never be a consensus on what constitutes worthwhile customization, but hey, you already know what I like. So everyone's going to have the same job, but not all of these characters are created equal. For example, monks can't learn the steal technique, but Vaughn, Balthier, and Fran know it innately. Can't learn Cure, but Fran and Ash have access to it by default. Fran can also cast fire. Balthier comes with a gun. We've got a well-rounded starting team to get us through the early game regardless of the jobs we pick. Because Fran comes with Cure, she can naturally slide into the cleric role, but we don't need her to go that route. Cure will fall off quickly since Monk doesn't learn any magic lores, and with that chemist build I talked about earlier, everyone's on equal ground. This is another standout characteristic of the job system. Any assortment of party members makes for an equally viable team. Take Final Fantasy IX for example. A player may really love Garnet and Eiko as characters, but they're both summoners that can cast white magic, and you may not want that redundancy on your team. Do you compromise and gimp your squad to use your favorite party members? Or do you bench one to include someone else with better utility? I like that I have to make that choice in Final Fantasy IX, and I don't think it's a worse game by forcing that consideration. Games with job systems, they let you use your favorite characters and force different considerations. They're not better, they're different. I just happen to prefer that difference. While I have the license board open, let's look at some of the options we can take. Monk can learn a fair bit of white magic, but there's a catch. You can grab the license that teaches Kiraja early on, but obtaining the spell itself is another story, since you can only buy it at around the last 20% of the game. There's also Cura up for grabs, but to reach it you need Hashmal, and you get him in the endgame, and if you made it that far you don't need Cura. The same applies for the rest of white magic. You need to fight optional endgame espers to reach them. There's an esper dynamic in the license board that's largely wasted on monks. When you beat an esper, you can acquire its license to summon it, and these are character specific. There's an opportunity cost. To reach a distant license for one character, you're giving up access to a different license on another. I love this system because it deepens each character's gameplay identity. But with Monk, the 2 early game espers, Belias and Mateus, they don't unlock anything. They don't connect to any out-of-reach licenses. The 2 optional ones you can reasonably obtain in the mid-game, Adremalech and Cuchulain?
Cuchulain.
What? That can't be right. Oh, it's Irish. I spent way too long looking into this. Basically, nobody knows how this word is pronounced. Here's the esper's name in Japanese.
Cuchulain.
Cuchulain. You know, that does sound like Cuchulain. What do you know? Well, these 2 espers, they also unlock nothing. Here's the thing. Late game espers unlock these licenses, which isn't useful if all we want to do is beat the game, but they still have value. Not necessarily for Monk, which is already a well-rounded job, but for other jobs because not only are there super bosses to fight, there's trial mode, and if you want to complete all 100 floors of trial mode, getting these distant licenses that unlock Renew and Arise starts to look tempting. But let's keep this simple. Here's how I'd work with 6 monks. Balthier's my favorite character, so he's going to be my lead. Aggro in this game is handled in a simple way. Enemies prioritize whoever's closest. Here's a white mage standing in the back while the melee fighter soaks up damage. So if Balthier is going to be the tank, he needs HP, and the HP licenses are all expensive. His main goal is to nab Accessory 6, which lets him equip the Golden Amulet, which doubles LP gain. We get a guaranteed one of these for free in the Ogariensa Sandsea, so we've got a bit of time to unlock this. Fran will be the chemist along with Ash when we eventually get her, so they both need to get Accessories 11 to unlock Pheasant Netsuke. We talked about that earlier, it boosts the effect of recovery items. We'll get the accessory itself in Jahara, which is roughly a quarter of the way into the game, so there's no rush. For everyone else, we've got some interesting techniques to consider. Wither is cool at lower strength, but you don't get it until the final dungeon appears. Expose is useful, but it lowers physical defense instead of magic defense, and that doesn't help monks since pulls hit for magic defense. If we had different physical fighters, we could make a utility monk that buffs and debuffs. In Final Fantasy XIII, this would be called a synergist or a saboteur. I like those names. Shades of Black is awesome since it casts random magic, even high-level ones like Scathe, but it's less useful if you don't have magic lores to boost its power. It can still cast status effects like Sleep, so there's some use there. There's nothing set in stone, but we have some cool options to consider as we work our way through the game, and we can pivot towards whatever fills the void in our team. This is just how I would consider making a team, but someone else may have a different approach. Maybe they want to subclass the monks and further each character's specialization. Maybe they want to rush the Niho Paleoa accessory. What is it called? Niho Palao? Niho Palao? I don't know. It basically reverses the effects of items and it lets you spam remedies on everything, so instead of curing the status ailments, it inflicts them. Maybe a player wants to rush quickenings on every character and spam them for the boss fights. Since monks make for great frontline fighters, you may throw back a swine on two party members to cast Berserk, then just walk around and watch them kill everything that moves. I like to go with the flow and roll what the game gives me, rather than working out a concrete plan, because that makes each playthrough feel more reactive. I don't know how things will end up, and that mystery leads to a stronger sense of adventure. This wound up sounding like a guide on how to play Final Fantasy XII. I always let myself get carried away, but I think you get the gist of what I see in the Job system. Square's published a number of games that use this progression system, and even though they share commonalities, I think devs have done a great job at giving each game a unique identity. Final Fantasy Tactics, by nature of being a tactical game, emphasizes movement. Some jobs move further than others, and some have faster turn orders, some ignore terrain height. Bravely Default has a strong sense of back and forth with the Brave and Default system. Borrowing turns gives you a massive damage swing at the cost of future turns. If you can prepare for an enemy's burst attack, you're given a large window to retaliate. Stranger of Paradise ditches the concept of turns entirely and emphasizes action. Jobs grant you robust movesets that all play differently from one another. Final Fantasy XIV, because it's a multiplayer game, bosses can have more complex patterns. Each player feels like they're a more worthwhile contributor in dungeons. A tank doesn't just sit there and soak up damage, he has to manage aggro. And it's not as simple as following a rotation because you've got to prioritize adds, and sometimes a party member might draw aggro by accident and need to react on the fly to save them. Final Fantasy XII balances the preparation that comes with turn-based games with the reactivity of an action game because it's real-time. It doesn't commit to one style over another because that would disturb the balance. If real-time were emphasized like Stranger of Paradise, that would take away from the preparation aspect of mitigating damage and balancing action priorities. If the preparation were emphasized, the real-time aspect would be automated. Gambits do this to an extent, but job restrictions bring that challenge back. There are a million different ways to play Final Fantasy XII, and at least for me, that's what makes it so special. It's one of the most feature-rich Final Fantasies out there, and it was the last time Square Enix offered something with this level of depth from the mainline series, at least for the single-player games. I suppose I should explain what I mean by that.